She thought she owned the neighborhood. She thought the rules were hers to make. But when she took a piece of his life for granted, she never imagined the price she'd have to pay. The line had been crossed, and payback was about to be served. One rule-breaking, jaw-dropping moment at a time. The heat shimmered off the newly paved asphalt of Magnolia Creek, a perfect, sun-drenched suburban kingdom ruled by a velvet fist. Mark stood on his back deck, a cold beer in hand, watching the cerulean water of his pool glisten. The chlorine smell was a subtle promise of escape. It had been a long, brutal year, and this house, this pool, was his peace treaty with the world. A hard-won piece of tranquility after a messy divorce that had left him feeling like a ghost in his old life. He'd spent every free moment of the past 2 months getting the yard perfect. He'd torn out the overgrown hedges, laid down fresh sod, and meticulously scrubbed every tile of the pool until it sparkled. This was his sanctuary, a testament to a fresh start. And in Magnolia Creek, a place where lawns were mowed on Tuesdays and no one dared to leave their garbage cans out past 6 p.m. on Wednesday evenings, a perfectly pristine pool was the ultimate status symbol. It made him feel like he finally belonged, even if he still only knew his neighbors by the vehicles they drove. The peace lasted exactly as long as it took for Brenda Caldwell to roll up in her pristine white Lexus. Brenda was the self-appointed queen of Magnolia Creek, a woman who wielded the HOA rulebook like a scepter. She was the one who had sent him a passive-aggressive email about his mailbox being a shade too rustic, and had once threatened to fine him for leaving his recycling bin out a full hour after collection. He'd only seen her from a distance, a blur of perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an expression of permanent, vague disapproval. He hadn't thought much of it then. It was just the cost of living in a place this perfect. He was due to fly out for a business trip the next day, a week-long grind in Dallas. He took a final appreciative look at his pool, the quiet ripples dancing in the late afternoon sun, before heading inside to pack. The last thing he did was set the automatic pool cleaner to run at 2 p.m. the following day and triple-check the latch on the gate. The HOA bylaws were surprisingly specific about pool security, a testament to Brenda's influence. The trip was a blur of fluorescent lights, stale coffee, and mind-numbing presentations. He missed the quiet of his new home, the simple pleasure of his own bed. By the time he landed back at the airport 7 days later, all he wanted was to crash on his couch and order a pizza. His car pulled into his driveway, and the first thing he noticed was the strange, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The smell of chlorine was stronger than he remembered, mixed with a faint, fruity scent. He walked around the side of the house, his pace quickening with a growing sense of unease. The gate was ajar. He'd locked it. He was certain. The memory of the metal click and the firm pull was as vivid as if it had happened moments ago. He pushed the gate open the rest of the way, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. His pool, his perfect, pristine sanctuary, was a mess. A bright pink inflatable flamingo lay half-deflated on the deck, its plastic beak pointing uselessly at the sky. A half-eaten bag of potato chips was splayed open near the patio table, a small trail of oily crumbs leading to the pool's edge. A wet, wrinkled towel with a cartoon unicorn on it was draped over one of his deck chairs. He picked it up, feeling the cold dampness of it against his skin. This wasn't a squirrel or a stray cat. This was human. Rage, hot and sudden, flushed through him. He'd been violated. His space, his private, sacred space, had been invaded and disrespected. The tranquility he'd sought was gone, replaced by a feeling of bitter indignation. He walked to the front of his house, his phone already in his hand. He'd call the police. He'd report the break-in. But then he saw it. 3 houses down, in front of the Caldwell residence, sat a matching deflated pink flamingo, half hidden behind a rose bush. Mark's jaw tightened. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that this was Brenda's doing, or more accurately, her daughter's. He didn't call the police. He called Brenda instead. He'd be calm, he'd be reasonable. He'd simply present the facts. He watched his reflection in the glass of his front door as he waited for her to answer, composing his words carefully. "Brenda Caldwell," her voice answered, a sharp, almost brittle sound. "Hi, Brenda. This is Mark, your neighbor at 122 Maple Lane," he said, trying to keep his voice even. "I just got back from a business trip and it seems someone used my pool while I was gone. The gate was left open and there's some garbage and a few pool toys left behind. I believe one of them belongs to you." There was a moment of silence on the other end. A pause pregnant with an anticipation he didn't yet understand. "Mr. Peterson," she said finally, her voice shifting from professional to a sickeningly sweet, condescending tone. "I'm sure you're mistaken. My daughter Haley and her friends are all very well-behaved children. I'm certain they wouldn't trespass on private property. I found a pink flamingo that matches the one in your yard," Mark countered, his voice a little less steady now. "My pool gate was locked when I left. Someone picked the lock or climbed over the fence. Well, if the gate was so secure, I'm sure." "It's just a misunderstanding," she said, the saccharine tone hardening into ice. "Perhaps a squirrel got in. You know, we have quite a problem with them in this area. As for the flamingo, it's a popular design, Mr. Peterson. I'm certain my daughter didn't do anything of the sort. Brenda, I'm not a fool. The towel with the, unicorn on it." "A unicorn towel?" she interrupted, a short, humorless laugh escaping her lips. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Peterson. This is Magnolia Creek. We are a community. We look out for one another. But we also have rules. And you, as a new resident, seem to have forgotten that. You have an obligation to secure your property." His reasonable tone was cracking. "I did secure my property. I'm just asking for an apology and for you to come get your stuff." "Apology? Mr. Peterson, you need to be very careful with your accusations," she said, the kindness now completely gone, replaced by the chilling, self-righteous authority of the HOA president. "I will have to remind you of Section 7.4b of the bylaws, which states that all pool owners are responsible for the security of their pool area at all times. Failure to do so can result in a fine of up to $500. Not only that, but I noticed a couple of weeds in your flower bed. That is a direct violation of Section 9.1a. You will be receiving a notice about that shortly." He was stunned into silence. He had called her to resolve a simple issue, and she had twisted it into an attack on him. She wasn't just denying her daughter's trespass. She was using her power to punish him for having the audacity to complain. "I think this conversation is over," she said, her voice dripping with finality. "Enjoy your homecoming, Mr. Peterson. I'll be in touch." The line went dead. Mark stood there, the phone still to his ear, listening to the dial tone. He felt a cold knot of dread form in his stomach. It wasn't just about the pool anymore. It was about her power, her entitlement, and her willingness to use the HOA as a weapon. He had moved here for peace, but he had found a battle. Over the next 2 days, the notices started to arrive. The first was a certified letter from the HOA, citing Section 7.4b and fining him $250 for inadequate pool security. Attached was a blurry, grainy photo of his still unlatched gate, taken from a distance. The fine had a due date of 10 days. He was sure it was her on his property, taking the picture. The second notice came the next day, a passive-aggressive email about his unapproved shade of green on his front door. The door was the exact same color as when he bought the house. He checked the original paperwork. The paint was listed as olive branch, a pre-approved color. He replied with a copy of the deed and the paperwork. The response was a 2-line email. "The current shade appears to be off. Please repaint." The third notice was the most ridiculous of all, a fine for improperly maintained fencing. He walked around his backyard, examining every inch of the white, vinyl fence. It was pristine. He had just power washed it the week before his trip. He saw a small, almost microscopic scuff mark near the back corner, and he knew instantly that this was her doing, her reason for the fine. The picture attached to the notice was so close up it was just a white blur with a small black dot. His sanity was beginning to fray. He was living in a state of constant low-level paranoia, checking his yard for imaginary weeds, his fence for new scuffs. He couldn't enjoy his pool, couldn't relax in his new home. The sanctuary he had created was being systematically dismantled by a petty tyrant. He went to his neighbor, Sarah, a kind-faced woman who had lived in Magnolia Creek for 15 years. She greeted him on her front porch, a glass of iced tea in her hand. "Mark, what's all this I hear about fines?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. "Brenda sent an email to the whole neighborhood, a passive-aggressive reminder about upholding community standards. It was clearly aimed at you." Mark explained everything: the trespass, the confrontation, the escalating fines. As he spoke, he felt the weight of his anger lift slightly, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "It's classic Brenda," Sarah said, shaking her head. "She's been running this place like a dictator for years. Her husband is a lawyer, and he writes all." Mark awoke not to the gentle hum of his alarm, but to the cold, crystalline clarity of a new day's purpose. The exhaustion from his meticulous study of the Magnolia Creek bylaws had been replaced by a focused, electric energy. He felt like a soldier preparing for a stealth mission, every action deliberate and charged with a newfound significance. He put on a nondescript gray hoodie and a pair of running shorts, the uniform of a neighbor out for a morning jog, not a man on the hunt for a legal violation. Brenda Caldwell's house was a masterpiece of suburban perfection, a monument to her unyielding standards. The grass was an impossibly green carpet. The azaleas were pruned into flawless spheres, and a small, tasteful fountain gurgled in the front garden. It was the kind of place that looked like it had been staged for a photo shoot and never disturbed. But Mark wasn't looking at the facade. He was looking for the cracks. He started his run slowly, a gentle loop around the block. With each pass, he subtly altered his route, drawing closer to her property line. The first pass was a test. He noted the placement of her security cameras, a subtle dome under the eaves of the front porch, another tucked into the corner of the garage. Brenda was a woman who watched her kingdom, a detail he hadn't fully appreciated until now. On his second pass, he slowed to a walk, feigning a stitch in his side. He leaned against a tall sycamore tree across the street, letting his gaze sweep across her property. The backyard, he knew from his deep dive into the bylaws, was where the real vulnerabilities would lie. The front was a public declaration of perfection, but the back was where the shortcuts and compromises might hide. He saw it on his third lap, as the first rays of the sun were beginning to paint the sky a soft rose color, a small, seemingly insignificant detail. The Caldwells had a tiered garden in their backyard, a series of terraced flower beds held in place by a low retaining wall made of stacked stone. From the front, it looked solid, but he saw it, near the corner of the wall where it met the privacy fence. One of the stones was slightly misaligned. It was almost invisible, a small imperfection that most people wouldn't notice. But Mark, with his new, hyper-vigilant eyes, saw the potential. He continued his run, his pace now quick and steady, looping the neighborhood once more. He needed a plan. He couldn't just walk into her backyard and start taking pictures. That would be an obvious act of trespass, something she would use against him with the force of a battering ram. He needed to be discreet. That night, he put his plan into motion. He waited until after midnight, when the neighborhood was quiet and the Caldwells' lights had all gone dark. He strapped on a small headlamp, its beam a narrow, focused circle, and slipped a compact digital camera into his pocket. He also brought a small, sturdy ruler. He needed to be able to show, with irrefutable evidence, the precise measurements of the defect. This wasn't just about finding a flaw. It was about meticulously documenting a legal violation. He scaled his own fence where it met hers, a feat of athleticism he hadn't known he possessed. He dropped silently onto the soft, cool grass of her yard, his heart thudding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The night was alive with the sound of crickets and the whisper of the wind through the leaves. Every rustle made him jump. Every distant car felt like a spotlight closing in. He crept along the line of the fence, the low gurgle of the fountain in the distance, a bizarre soundtrack to his clandestine mission. He reached the retaining wall, the stones cool and rough against his fingertips. His headlamp beam was a precise, searching finger of light. He found the misaligned stone he had spotted earlier, and his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just misaligned, it was loose. The mortar around it had crumbled, and with a gentle push, the entire stone wobbled precariously. The retaining wall was designed to hold back a considerable amount of soil and pressure. A single weak point could compromise the entire structure. This wasn't a minor infraction. It was, as the bylaws so eloquently put it, a significant and unremediated safety hazard. It was a potential liability, a trip hazard, and a ticking time bomb. He took out his camera and began his documentation. Close-up photos of the crumbling mortar. Wide shots of the entire wall, showing the larger context. He placed the ruler in the gap where the stone was loose, a clear, damning measurement. He even took a short video, pushing the stone with a gloved finger to show its instability. The video was a powerful, undeniable piece of evidence. He worked quickly, silently, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He returned home the same way he had come, scaling the fence and landing back in his yard, the cool night air feeling like a triumphant welcome. He had done it. He had the proof. The next morning, he spent an hour in his home office composing a letter. It wasn't an email. It was a formal, legalistic document typed with precise, professional formatting. He addressed it to the Magnolia Creek Homeowners Association, ATN Board of Directors. He cited Section 14.3G of the bylaws and his discovery of a significant and unremediated safety hazard on the property of 124 Maple Lane. He attached the high-resolution photographs and a time-stamped link to the video he had uploaded to a private cloud-based server. He demanded an immediate and thorough investigation, as per the bylaws, and warned them of the potential for liability if the issue was not addressed within 24 hours. He signed it with his full name, Mark Peterson, and a copy of his property deed. He took the letter to the post office himself, paying for certified mail and a return receipt. The postal worker, a kind-faced woman who always smiled, had no idea she was about to deliver a missile into the heart of Magnolia Creek's suburban empire. The certified letter arrived at Brenda's doorstep 2 days later. He imagined her receiving it, her perfectly manicured nails ripping open the envelope, her eyes scanning the official letterhead. The fury must have been instantaneous. The phone rang just a few hours later. It was an unrecognized number. He knew it was her. He answered it calmly. "Mark Peterson?" she said, her voice a low, furious hiss. It was the same tone she'd used when she'd threatened him with fines, but now it was laced with a venomous disbelief. "What in the hell is this?" "Brenda," he said, his voice as calm and collected as he could make it. "It's a report of a safety hazard on your property, as per Section 14.3G of the HOA bylaws." You snuck onto my property?" she spluttered, her voice rising with each word. "You're a trespasser. I'm going to call the police." "I took photos from a public right-of-way, Brenda," he lied smoothly, "and a vantage point from my own property, line. I'm afraid the photos and the video are completely admissible, and as you know, under the bylaws, it's my duty as a homeowner to report such a hazard. I'm just doing my part to ensure the safety of our community." He had learned to play her game, to use her own sanctimonious language against her. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. She was trying to process his new persona, the shift from quiet victim to meticulous opponent. "This is ridiculous. It's a few loose stones. My husband, Ken, is a lawyer. He wrote those bylaws. He'll have you for slander and libel and harassment." "Slander is a false statement, Brenda," Mark countered, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. "The evidence is in the packet you received. As for harassment, I'm simply following the letter of the law. Your bylaws, the ones your husband wrote. You have 24 hours to address the issue before I have to escalate to the full board and, potentially, the city's code enforcement office." He could hear her breathing, a ragged, angry sound. He had found her weakness. She was a woman who lived for appearances. The thought of city code enforcement, of an official public inspection of her property, was probably an unbearable humiliation. It would be a stain on her perfect record, on her perfect lawn, on her perfect house. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "I'll make your life a living hell. The fines you've received are just the beginning." "They've already been challenged, Brenda," Mark said, his voice now a low, confident tone. "As per my reading of the bylaws, your fines for my paint color and my fence were issued improperly. The first was on a pre-approved color, and the second was for a non-existent defect. You failed to follow the proper procedure for issuing a fine under Section 9.1A, which requires a 3-day courtesy notice before a formal fine. You skipped straight to the fine. I've already sent a letter to the HOA treasurer challenging them. I'm sure you'll be getting a copy of that soon." She hung up without another word. The silence was deafening, but this time it was a sound of victory. He had found his strength, and he had used her own weapon to hit her where she was most vulnerable. He had been a passive observer in her kingdom. Now he was a rebel, a saboteur from within. The next day, a black, meticulously detailed luxury, Seddon pulled into the Caldwell driveway. Mark watched from his window as a tall, imposing man in a sharp business suit got out. Ken Caldwell, the lawyer husband. He was carrying a briefcase. This wasn't a friendly visit. This was business. Mark watched as Brenda met him at the door, her face a mask of furious indignation. She showed him the letter. She talked, her hands gesticulating wildly, her voice clearly raised in a panicked retelling of events. Ken listened, his expression growing more grim with each passing moment. He didn't look angry. He looked professional, like a surgeon assessing a problem. He walked into. The silence that followed Ken Caldwell's arrival was more menacing than any of Brenda's shouting. It wasn't the hush of a neighborhood settling for the evening. It was the quiet before the storm. Mark watched from his window, a single slit in his blinds as Ken, tall and impeccably dressed, stood by the retaining wall, his hands on his hips. He wasn't looking at the loose stone with anger, but with the cold, critical eye of an expert assessing a problem. This was no longer a battle of wills between neighbors. It was a legal assessment. Brenda's indignation had been replaced by the tactical calculation of a professional. Brenda, a furious blur of agitation, gesticulated wildly as she spoke to her husband. Ken, however, remained calm, his expression unreadable. He crouched, touched the wobbly stone with the tip of his polished shoe, and then stood, slowly shaking his head. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a silent admission that Mark had found a legitimate flaw, a legal chink in their otherwise impenetrable armor. The game had changed. Brenda was a bully, Ken was a general. An hour later, as dusk began to settle over Magnolia Creek, a knock echoed on Mark's front door. He knew who it was. The knock was firm, deliberate, and entirely lacking in the familiar casualness of a neighborly visit. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and opened the door. Ken Caldwell stood on his porch, not with a furious wife in tow, but alone. He was a man in his late 50s, his silver hair neatly combed, his jaw set in a hard professional line. The suit was expensive and tailored, a stark contrast to the casual shorts Mark was wearing. Ken didn't smile. He just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice a low, modulated baritone that sounded like it was used to giving orders in a courtroom. "My wife tells me you found a problem with our landscaping." Mark met his gaze directly. He felt a jolt of genuine fear, the kind that comes from standing in the presence of a man who held real power. "I found a significant safety hazard, Mr. Caldwell, as per my obligation under the HOA bylaws." Ken's eyes narrowed slightly, a subtle shift that showed he'd already read Mark's letter and was assessing the threat. "You're a man of the rules, I see, a stickler for detail." It wasn't a compliment. "I am," Mark replied, refusing to be baited, especially when those rules are being used as weapons. A flicker of something, amusement, contempt, Mark couldn't tell, crossed Ken's face. "Let's be direct, shall we? You sent my wife a letter demanding she fix a small, insignificant problem. You've also filed a challenge to the minor fines she issued you. Am I correct?" "The fines were not minor, Mr. Caldwell, and they were issued improperly." Mark kept his voice steady. "And the problem with your retaining wall is a legitimate safety hazard. It's a liability to the HOA, and as a member it was my duty to report it." Ken stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "I'm a lawyer, Mr. Peterson. The bylaws you've so diligently studied? I wrote them, every last one of those 200 pages. I wrote them to be ironclad. You are a new resident, an amateur in this game. I suggest you reconsider your position before you find yourself in a situation you are wholly unprepared for." "I'm just asking for the rules to be applied fairly," Mark said, his courage wavering but not breaking. "Brenda issued me fines for imagined infractions. You can't tell me that's fair." "Fairness is a matter of perspective," Ken said, his voice dropping to an even more dangerous tone. "The reality is that my wife is the head of the HOA. She is responsible for the integrity of this community, and you, in your first few months here, have made yourself an antagonist. I have reason to believe you've also trespassed on my property. To obtain your evidence. Trespassing is a crime, Mr. Peterson, a very simple one to prove. I have video evidence, Mr. Caldwell," Mark said, a slow, cold confidence spreading through him. "You won't be able to argue against it. The bylaws are very clear on significant safety hazards. Your wall is a ticking time bomb. The moment it fails and someone gets hurt, the HOA will be held responsible. And if I am to understand this correctly, you will be liable as well." Ken's eyes, which had been fixed on Mark's, now dropped to a point over his shoulder. He was thinking, calculating. He was no longer trying to intimidate, but to find a counter-move. "Here is my offer," he said finally, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You rescind your letter. You withdraw your challenge to the fines. In return, the fines will be dismissed, and we will consider the matter closed. You're a new resident. Let's not let a small misunderstanding ruin your experience here." It was a classic lawyer's gambit, the olive branch of a truce, but with a loaded gun hidden behind his back. He was offering a way out, a way for Mark to go back to his life before this all began. And for a moment, Mark was tempted. The thought of peace, of simply enjoying his beautiful home and his pristine pool, was a powerful one. But then he remembered the crumpled unicorn towel, the half-eaten bag of chips, and the cold, unyielding face of Brenda Caldwell. He remembered the feeling of helplessness as the fines had piled up, 1,000 cuts designed to drive him out. He had not just found a rule, he had found his backbone. "No," Mark said, the single word hanging in the air like a stone dropped into a still pond. "I won't. I'm not withdrawing anything. You fix the retaining wall, and the fines against me are dismissed without any conditions on my part. And then, and only then, will I consider the matter closed." Ken's face hardened, all traces of the professional veneer gone. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Peterson. You don't understand who you're dealing with." "I think I do," Mark countered, a new kind of calm settling over him. "I'm dealing with someone who thinks the rules are for everyone else, and I'm just here to remind you that they apply to you too." Without another word, Ken turned and walked off the porch. He didn't slam the door or make a theatrical exit. He simply left, the sound of his footsteps a precise measured rhythm on the walkway. The message was clear. The negotiations were over. The next few days were quiet, too quiet. Mark was on high alert, checking his mail for new fines, his phone for new threats. But nothing came. The silence was more terrifying than the noise, a suffocating pressure that told him they were planning something. He knew Ken wouldn't let this go. The stakes were too high for the Caldwells now. It wasn't just about the money, but about their power and their prestige in the neighborhood. Mark had struck a blow against their authority, and they couldn't let that stand. He continued to go about his life, but with a new layer of paranoia. He kept his camera on him at all times, took pictures of his yard every morning, and made a point of talking to Sarah, his neighbor, who offered a sympathetic ear and an occasional piece of advice. The retaliation, when it came, didn't come from the HOA. It was far more insidious, far more personal. It was a Friday morning. Mark was in his home office, a space he had meticulously set up for his work as a software architect. He was on a video call with his project manager, discussing a new system launch. Mid-sentence, he noticed an email pop up in his personal inbox, a notification that stood out from the usual flood of spam. It was from his HR department. The subject line was, "Urgent, complaint regarding professional conduct." He felt a cold, leaden weight settle in his gut. His hands started to tremble. He excused himself from the call, his project manager's face, a blur of concern on the screen. He clicked the email open. It was a formal notification. The email stated that an anonymous complaint had been filed with the company's HR department, alleging that he was using his position and company resources to harass a member of his community, fabricating evidence to pursue a personal vendetta. It contained vague but damning accusations of unprofessional and unstable behavior, and said that he was being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Mark's blood ran cold. The email had been forwarded from an anonymous tip line, a service designed to protect whistleblowers. But he didn't need to see a name to know who had sent it. The language was precise and calculated. The phrasing, fabricating evidence, unstable behavior, was pure Ken Caldwell. The anonymous nature was a telltale sign of Brenda's cowardice. They hadn't just fought back. They had taken the fight outside of the neighborhood, into the one place he had thought was safe. They had gone for his livelihood, for the very foundation of his new life. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic, terrified drumbeat. They were playing for keeps. The polite, legal chess match was over. It was now a war, and the first shot had just been fired straight at his career. The world, which had been a clear and ordered place just moments before, dissolved into a frantic, terrifying blur. The words on the screen, administrative leave, professional conduct, anonymous complaint, were a gut punch. They weren't just a threat. They were a strike at the very foundation of Mark's new life, the very reason he had moved to this neighborhood in the first place. He had spent his savings on this house, on this sanctuary, and now Brenda and Ken Caldwell were trying to burn it all down. He slammed his laptop shut, the sound echoing in the silent office. The anger he had felt before was now a cold, desperate terror. This wasn't a game of fines and rules anymore. This was a battle for his livelihood. He could fix a loose stone. He could challenge a ridiculous fine. But fighting a vague, anonymous, corporate complaint from an anonymous source felt like trying to punch a ghost. His first impulse was to call his boss, to explain everything. But the email from HR had been very clear. No discussion of the matter with anyone in the company. He was to contact the HR representative and a company-appointed legal counsel. This was a process, a sterile, legalistic machine designed to be slow and merciless. He knew that by the time he could prove the complaint was baseless, the damage to his reputation would be done. He needed help. He picked up his phone and dialed the one number he knew would offer both a sympathetic ear and practical advice. Sarah answered on the second ring. "Mark, are you okay? You sound terrible," she said, her voice laced with immediate concern. He told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear and indignation. He explained the email, the administrative leave, the anonymous complaint. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Oh, Mark," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "I warned you about Ken. He's not like Brenda. He doesn't just play with rules, he plays with lives. He found your weakness and he went for it." "What do I do?" Mark asked, the question raw and full of a helplessness he hadn't felt since the fines began. "I can't fight this. It's their word against mine, and they're anonymous." "They're not anonymous to you," Sarah said, her voice firming. "You know exactly who did this. You know why. They've gone too far, Mark. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore. This is criminal. This is harassment, plain and simple. And you have to fight back harder than you ever have." Her words were a wake-up call. He couldn't just defend himself. He had to go on the offensive. He had to hit them where they lived, not just in their physical home, but in their public image, their social standing, and their carefully curated sense of superiority. He went to his home office, his mind now clear, focused. He pulled up his computer and started a new document. This was a new letter, one he would not be sending to the HOA, but directly to the Caldwells. It would be a declaration of war. He opened with a formal, legalistic tone that mirrored their own. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell," he typed. "This letter serves as official notification. I have been placed on administrative leave from my position as a software architect at Genesis Solutions. The reason provided was an anonymous complaint alleging unprofessional conduct and the misuse of company resources to pursue a personal vendetta." He then laid out his evidence, not in the vaguest of terms, but with a cold, precise fury. "I am aware that this complaint was filed by you. The timing, the specific language, and the context of our ongoing dispute regarding your failure to maintain your property, as per Section 14.3g of the Magnolia Creek bylaws, make it undeniably clear that you are the source of this complaint. This is a malicious act of retaliation, not a genuine concern for professional ethics." He then moved on to the threat, the final devastating trump card he was holding. He couldn't prove his case in court without a massive legal fight he couldn't afford, but he could prove it in the court of public opinion. "My investigation into your activities is expanding. Your repeated harassment, your daughter's trespass, your improper fines, and now this malicious complaint are no longer a private matter. If the complaint filed against me is not formally and verifiably retracted from my employer within 48 hours, I will be taking this story to the media. I have already compiled a dossier of all our correspondence, including your fines, my report on your safety hazard, and the details of my administrative leave. I have a contact at the local news station, a journalist who specializes in consumer advocacy and community disputes." He knew he was bluffing about the contact, but it didn't matter. The threat was real. He would find a journalist. He would go to the media. The idea of Ken Caldwell, the prominent lawyer, and Brenda, the social queen of Magnolia Creek, being featured on the evening news as petty, vindictive harassers was a nightmare they couldn't afford. It would ruin their reputations, jeopardize Ken's business, and turn the entire neighborhood against them. "This is no longer about a retaining wall or a fine," he wrote, the words now flowing with a furious, righteous energy. "This is about an abuse of power, a campaign of harassment, and an illegal act of retribution. You have crossed a line, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell. And unless you take immediate action to correct this egregious wrong, I will make sure the entire city knows exactly who you are." He printed the letter, his hands shaking, and then drove it to the post office. This time, he didn't just ask for certified mail. He requested a return receipt, a signature confirmation, and a photocopy of the envelope for his own records. He wanted no ambiguity. They would receive this letter, and they would know he was serious. He returned home and tried to busy himself, but the silence of the house was suffocating. He waited, his stomach tied in knots. He knew this was the last move, the final Hail Mary. If this didn't work, he was out of options. The next afternoon, just before dusk, he heard a car pull into the Caldwell driveway. It was a different car this time, a sleek black SUV with tinted windows. He saw a man in a crisp suit emerge, a younger version of Ken, a man who looked like he dealt with public relations crises for a living. He was holding a large manila envelope. Brenda met him at the door, her face a mask of panicked rage. She was talking fast, her hands gesticulating wildly. Ken emerged from the house, his expression grim and defeated. He took the envelope from the man and held it up, showing Brenda the address. He then looked at Brenda, his face a silent, withering indictment. She was not a queen anymore. She was a liability. He had tried to solve a legal problem, but she had created a public relations disaster. The three of them stood there for a long time, talking in hushed, angry tones. Mark couldn't hear what they were saying, but he didn't need to. He saw Ken shake his head slowly, and then with a final, defeated gesture, he took the manila envelope and walked inside, Brenda following. Behind him, her head bowed. The message was clear. They were backing down. Mark's gambit had worked. He had forced them into a corner from which there was no escape. He went to his computer and saw a new email notification. It was from his HR representative. He hesitated, for a moment, then opened it. It was short and to the point. The anonymous complaint had been withdrawn. All allegations had been rescinded. He was reinstated, effective immediately. The administrative leave had been lifted. A new, official letter was on its way. A wave of pure, unadulterated relief washed over him, followed by a quiet, fierce triumph. He hadn't just won the battle of the bylaws, he had forced them to surrender. He had stared down the lawyer, the bully, and the entire system they had built. The fight was not over, not entirely, but he had just won the one that mattered most. And now, he could finally sit by his pool and feel the true peace he had been searching for all along. The relief that washed over Mark upon reading the email was so profound, it felt physical, like a heavy weight had been lifted from his chest. The anonymous complaint had been withdrawn. He was reinstated. The threat to his career, to his very livelihood, was gone. But a quiet, simmering resolve remained. The Battle of Magnolia Creek was not over. The Caldwells had retreated, but they had not yet been defeated. He spent the next few days in a state of watchful peace. He received a formal letter from the HOA treasurer, a brief note confirming that all fines against his property had been rescinded due to procedural discrepancies. There was no mention of Brenda, no apology, just the cold, bureaucratic language of an organization trying to cover its tracks. The contractors arrived at the Caldwell residence a week later. Mark watched from his window as a crew meticulously dismantled the faulty retaining wall, replacing the crumbling mortar and securing the loose stones. The project took 3 days. It was a silent admission of guilt, a very public confession of the very thing they had denied. Brenda and Ken remained inside, their presence a silent, defeated shadow behind the curtains. The retaliation had been ugly and personal, but Mark's countermove had hit them where they were most vulnerable, their reputation. They had been exposed not just to him, but to the professional world. And now, they were being forced to fix the very problem he had found. But as he sat by his pool, finally able to enjoy the quiet solitude he had craved, he knew it wasn't enough. True payback wasn't just about forcing them to comply. It was about taking away their power to ever do this to anyone again. He found it in the bylaws. Tucked away in the section on board member elections and removal, he found the perfect rule. The bylaws stipulated that an HOA board member could be challenged in a special election if a petition was signed by 25% of the homeowners. Brenda's reign was not permanent. It was a democratic illusion, one he was now determined to expose. He began his quiet campaign. He wasn't loud or confrontational. He didn't rant about Brenda or Ken. He simply knocked on doors and talked to his neighbors, starting with Sarah. He showed them the fines he had received, the ridiculous charges for a paint color, and an invisible scuff mark. He showed them the certified letter he had sent to the Caldwells regarding the safety hazard. He framed his case not as a personal vendetta, but as a crusade for fairness. He talked about accountability and transparency. He was simply a man who believed in the rules, but only when they were applied equally. His neighbors, who had lived under Brenda's rule for years, were tired. They were tired of the anonymous emails, the petty fines, and the constant fear of a knock on the door. One by one, they signed his petition. The number grew steadily, quietly. Mark's list of signatures became a physical testament to the community's quiet suffering. He filed the petition in person at the HOA office, a sterile, quiet room where Brenda was a fixture. The look on her face when she saw him, not as a defiant neighbor, but as the official challenger to her authority, was a sight he would never forget. It was a mix of shock, disbelief, and finally, pure, unadulterated terror. The special election was set for 3 weeks later. The final payback wasn't a fine or a confrontation. It was a simple, democratic act of justice. Mark didn't just want to win, he wanted to dismantle her kingdom from the inside out. He ran his campaign on a simple platform: fairness and clear rules for everyone. He promised to publish all board meeting minutes, create an open forum for complaints, and, most importantly, to never use the HOA's power as a weapon against a fellow homeowner. He was the quiet neighbor who had been pushed too far, and now he was the voice of everyone who had suffered in silence. The election results came in on a rainy Tuesday evening. The votes were counted, and the outcome was not even close. Mark won by a landslide. He had not just defeated Brenda, he had utterly humiliated her. The reign of the HOA queen was over. His first official act as the new HOA president was to send a certified letter to every homeowner in Magnolia Creek. It was short and to the point. He thanked them for their support and promised a new era of transparency. He then signed it with his full name, Mark Peterson, a new name in power. The revenge wasn't in the victory, it was in the irony. The quiet neighbor, who was almost ruined by the rules, had now become the arbiter of them. Weeks later, Mark sat on his back deck, a cool beer in his hand, watching the cerulean water of his pool glisten. The sun was setting, painting the sky in a wash of soft colors. He had his peace back. The sound of children's laughter drifted over from the distance, the sound of a neighborhood finally free. He had fought a battle he never wanted, but in doing so, he had found his place. The revenge wasn't in the victory, it was in the irony. The quiet neighbor, who was almost ruined by the rules, had now become the arbiter of them. The HOA. Karen never expected his payback, and now she lived under the rules of the man she had tried to destroy.